Well, welcome to Unit 7, and we're going to begin by considering two different types of fear. In Study 1, we'll first look at circumstantial fear. And what I term as circumstantial fear is anxiety that's relating to a current event, such as maybe a storm or a particular financial situation or some other thing that's happening in the present. Now, these don't relate to anything that you've already believed from fearful times in the past. And to give you an example of this, we were recently booked in to run a number of healing schools in Kenya in Africa at the same time as they were running their elections. Now, these elections are often volatile and violent times in Kenya, and many people, including some of the Kenyan ministers that had invited us to come, actually warned us not to come. Now, my wife and I, we both prayed about it, and together we had a peace about the trip, and so we decided to go and fulfill our commitments anyway. When we arrived, many of the pastors commented that we must be very brave. But the truth is, they'd been through anxious times with elections before. But for us, we had no precedent, or we had no beliefs about potential harm to influence our decision. So we were not actually brave. We were simply people who had an absence of fear, which is not the same thing. Courageous people push through their fears in spite of difficult situations that they may face. In fact, I recall once that Napoleon's bravest general at one time couldn't mount his house because his knees were shaking so violently. And reportedly, he looked down at his knees, his legs, and he said something along the lines of, "If you knew where I was taking you next, you would shake much more than that." So he was not prepared to submit to fear and let it dictate what he was going to do or activities that he was going to be involved in. Now, I'm sure that once he was in battle, the fear would have been displaced with the activity. But the lesson is that I'm trying to make here is we always have a choice if we don't have a pre-existing belief from a past event that's already in play. For Christians, if God is for us, who can be against us? For believers, the only real choice is faith. All right, so let's have a look at a practical theology of dealing with circumstantial fear. Now, the Bible gives us a theology of how to deal with fear in our present tense circumstances where there is no historical precedent. In other words, the fear is not coming from something we already believe or learnt earlier in life. And the Bible shows us how to practically deal with fears that are new situations to us by displacing them in choosing to trust and have faith in God. This, of course, assumes that we're, as I said, free from beliefs stemming from the past. But now I'm told there are 366 fear nots in the Bible. That's one for each day of the year, and even leap years covered. So in the event that you're captive to a fear that came to you before you knew how to respond or had God in your life, then you most probably need to be set free by a truth encounter, a ministry session with the Holy Spirit. So before we examine how to be set free at heart level from historical fear beliefs, which is that we'll do in the last two studies in this unit, let's first examine what our mindsets, or let's call it our default position should be, our automatic response should be in regards to submitting to this circumstantial fear that we're talking about. And there are some excellent pictures of this that Jesus gave us in the Gospels. So in Matthew 14, we see the story of an event that produced fear in the disciples that had no historical precedence. In other words, it wasn't a fear that they had, a situation that they had to deal with before. And the setting is that Jesus had just fed the 5,000 people, multiplying 5 loaves and 2 fish. And I believe, as I've said in other places in the school, one aspect of what he was doing was to move the apostles from the basic principles of the world in terms of what they believed was possible to understanding that all things are possible with God. God is never confined or limited to the program that this world runs on. So I take heart that the apostles were a little bit slow picking this up as well. So God's got patience and grace for us. All right, so after the feeding, rather than travel across with the lake with them as usual, he made them go ahead. He actually, in the scripture we see in Matthew 14:22, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. Now, I believe that he did this purposefully in order to challenge their believing and their God picture with yet another supernatural act on the back of feeding the 5,000. And as you read the following verses, keep in mind that they had never seen anyone walk on water before, and so they had no previous beliefs from any such experience. This was an entirely new situation and a new circumstance that they were dealing with. And as we read the account in Matthew 14, verse 25, it says, during the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, so this is what you do. He said to them, take courage, it is I. So you do that, you choose that. And then he said, don't be afraid. So you don't do that. So their automatic response to a new situation was choosing fear. Although not deliberate, this was their, we would call it an automatic or a default position. And in verse 28, we see Peter saying, Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came towards Jesus. So Peter did do it. He exercised his faith. He chose to believe. And then in verse 30 it says, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid and immediately beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. And he said, this is important, you of little faith, in other words, little belief. He said, why did you doubt? So the reason for his fear and the reason for their fear was their lack of faith and their doubting. But he was trying to get Peter to see that his response was automatically fear, where Jesus was trying to move them to rethink their default position to being faith. That's why he asked him why. Why? Notably, Peter did have enough trust in and faith in Jesus to step out on his word. So the principle here is that while he looked to Jesus, he was doing fine. But when he heeded his situation and his circumstances, he was not fine. So we could summarize that saying that faith makes you float or puts you above or over your circumstances, but fear makes you sink and puts you under the power of your circumstances and the basic principles of this world. So faith can make us walk over our situations because it's centered in a supernatural or above the natural being, namely God. So the lesson is fear will make you subject to your natural outcomes as a result of being submitted to your surroundings and senses. All right. Let's look at when Jesus talks to the storm in Mark chapter 4. Now we see Jesus again assessing where the disciples were up to in terms of their moving from circumstantial fear to a faith response in God. We call fear the what-if spirit. And as an opposite to faith, real fear believes that another spiritual being can have the final say in outcomes producing something negative. And I've been at sea in storms, and I can imagine some of the thoughts behind the fear that was happening in the boat. You can imagine them thinking, what if, remember, what if is the fear spirit. What if Peter's repair on the hull doesn't hold? What if we cannot bail the water out quickly enough? What if Luke's knot doesn't hold on the mast? After all, he is a physician. What if Jesus doesn't wake up and tell us what to do? So you can see that fear projects into what if, looking for potential negative outcomes even though they haven't happened yet. For these guys, there may have been a whole myriad of beliefs and thoughts that together grip them with the fear. So we look in Mark 4 verse 39, and it says, then he arose and rebuked the wind and the sea, and said to the sea, peace, be still. and the wind ceased and there was a great calm. But he said to them, why? Again, you see, he's trying to get them to think, why are you so fearful? And how is it that you have no faith? Okay, so Jesus attributed their fear to their lack of faith. And we will either submit to or come under one or the other. In regards to new situations, it's always a choice which we will have to make. Many times, how we decide to respond is based on our previous experiences of God coming through for us. And Jesus always, as we look at this whole situation, always seemed committed to releasing his disciples into the supernatural potential of the faith dimension rather than being submitted to fear and having to live under that outcome. So fear is really faith in reverse. So he took them through many situations that were possibly places of having to choose what they were going to believe. Another such time was after the feeding of the 5,000. He now fed the 4,000 in the hope that the dawning of understanding would come to them. And we can all thank God that he is so patient with us in our journey out of fear and into faith. He is in fact the author and finisher of our faith, and you'll see that in Hebrews 12 verse 2. In other words, we're on a journey, but he's actually working on our progress and how that will develop. So whatever page we're on in the book or pilgrimage into faith that we're on, we can be sure that he will complete the good work that he began in us. And we see that in Philippians 1 verse 6. In any case, the disciples were not yet thinking about the supernatural potential of faith. So we can take heart that later, of course, when they did understand, they turned the whole world upside down with the gospel. And then Matthew 16 verse 8, so remember, now we're talking about the feeding of the 5,000. It says, but Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, O you of little faith, why do you reason amongst yourselves because you have brought no bread? So in other words, for them, it was not settled. They weren't resolute. They weren't convinced. They had little faith. And then he went on to say in verse 9, do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? So Jesus pointed to remembering previous things that God had done as the means by which to reprogram your expectations to a place of faith. So we could summarize our part in releasing God into our situations and that which he wants to do through us, something such as this. Unbelief expects nothing to happen. Fear expects something bad to happen, whereas faith expects something positive or good to happen. All right, let's redefine fear under some other names to help us see it and recognize it in our lives. Now, you may know fear in one of its many forms, for example, anxiety, which is a low-grade fear, stress, distress, worry, tension, restlessness, dread, apprehension, or insecurity. These are all other names for fear. Additionally, we might add in things like hopelessness, helplessness, doubt, or unbelief. They're forms of fear because they don't include the presence, power, or willingness of God to resolve whatever it is that we're confronted with. So unbelief is really a form of fear. We don't believe that God is going to do what he said he would do. So to summarize fear, we could define it as an expectation of a negative outcome. I was doing some study quite a few years ago on what different people had to say about fear, and some books that I read cited the existence of over 5,000 known fears. And I wondered, well, how will I manage to remember all of these fears? Now, a thought came into my mind, fear is whatever you're afraid of. Fear is whatever you're afraid of. It's hardly a blinding revelation, but nonetheless it resolved the issue once and for all for me. And when we're ministering to others or even examining our own selves, it's not necessary to work through a list. We simply identify what it is that the person is afraid of. What are you worried about happening? What do you think will happen if? All right, let's talk about good fear. So we use the term a universal emotion. In other words, something that's a predictable feeling or response that would happen in a given situation. But it's something that can be distorted by the devil as a consequence of the fall. Now, God gave us fear as a protective instinct. As a result, we don't normally play on highways or near cliffs. We don't, as a rule, kiss snakes on the lips. It's just not smart. So we have a natural fear, and so we can say then that there is a good, wise, God-given fear that protects us. And this includes the fear of God, which helps to protect us from making bad choices that do lead to negative outcomes. So that's good fear. But what we're talking about is the distorted version of fear that deceives us that we need to protect ourselves when in fact it's not necessary or it's not even beneficial. It's fear that we're not meant to have and things that we're not meant to fear. At times we can exercise faith to displace fear, and that's the fear that I'm talking about. It's times when we should be exercising faith. Now, fear began back in the Garden of Eden, where man, Adam and Eve, no longer believed that God had their best interests at heart and was keeping good things from them. So they accepted that God wasn't for them. In fact, he was against them, holding good things from them. So in essence, as I say, they doubted that he really loved them. This was unbelief, or probably more aptly, as some have put it, wrong belief, which is the basis of all of our anxieties. As a result, we understand and receive God's love and acceptance both in our minds and hearts. As we do, we find ourselves being freed from many of our fears, or from our many fears. And I sometimes ask for a show of hands in congregations where we're ministering, if any of the people who have no fear at all, if they would like to put their hands up. So far, I've never seen a single hand raised anywhere. So everybody seems to have some sort of fears. Now, when we read 1 John 4:18, it says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. But he who fears has not been made perfect in love. We love him because he first loved us. So equally, we could say that the antithesis or natural enemy of fear, faith, also proceeds from believing that there's no longer any need to expect negative outcomes for us. This knowledge of his love for us, both in our mind and our heart, receives that God has shown his love first by redeeming us and paying the penalty for our transgressions. So there's no longer any reason to expect punishment or to feel tormented and anxious about our situation. So the lesson is that God gave us fear for our protection. And as with everything else that God created, the devil seeks to distort it and destroy us through it. All right, when we return, we're going to look at fear coming from our present circumstances that, as we've said, isn't affected by previous beliefs or previous experiences. And we're going to unpack that a little bit more in part 2 on circumstantial belief. So we'll see you soon.